For joining us in Eno's latest webinar. I'm Brianne EB, a senior policy analyst at Eno. Today I'm looking forward to a discussion about the changing mobility landscape. Today's presentation will cover new regulatory approaches to managing sidewalks and curbs in cities. Joining us is Stephen Goldsmith from the Harvard Kennedy School. He was previously the deputy mayor of New York and mayor of Indianapolis, where he became a national leader in public-private partnerships. While Stephen is speaking, you can submit questions using the questions function at any time. We'll then go to about 15 minutes of Q&A, and you can, of course, submit questions then as well. Today's presentation will be available after the fact on Eno's website. With that, I will turn it over to Stephen.
Thank you very much, and good to join you. We'll just stick today with PowerPoint, and that way people won't have to actually stare at my face while we go forward, and then we'll take the questions afterwards. So what I thought we could do today is just spend 15 or 20 minutes just talking about how to conceptualize the changes that are occurring in mobility generally, but specifically about how we're considering curbs and sidewalks. I was mayor of Indianapolis some time ago, where the current digital tools didn't exist at all. Deputy mayor 6+ years ago for Mike Bloomberg, where the digital tools existed, but even those that existed then look pretty outdated compared to what's happened today. So let's talk a little bit about those changes and then maybe how creatively cities are applying them today. So let's go to the next slide. So as we think about the changing nature of city streets and sidewalks, I started my career as a city attorney. I was a corporate attorney, then became a city attorney. And a curb and sidewalk is a place where people fell and sued you, right? So it was not exactly an asset. So as we think about curbs and sidewalks today, they've moved from liabilities to assets. But the other issues that we see that are so dominant that were less dominant over the last 10 years are an important emphasis on equity. Of course, those issues were always there, but they're more appreciated now in their importance. Digital platforms, not just digital platforms are everywhere, but in this space, they're particularly interesting because we have digital platforms that are individual, like personal, like I have an iPhone or an Android. We have digital platforms in terms of how commercial providers and vendors are putting together various digital solutions, and we have government's role as a platform itself. And then as we think about the dramatic nature of the change, and the purpose of these 7 is not to tell you anything you don't already know, but to think about how they come together and compound each other in the scale of change. There's new forms of mobility, right? Uber's TNCs, lifts generally, but then we have scooters and we have a number of other shared vehicles, and eventually we'll have AVs. And what else do we have at the curb that competes for space, particularly in commercial areas? We have in many of our cities, counties, and states, new mobility management offices, right? A whole office that didn't exist back when I was deputy mayor of New York, in charge of operations. There was a taxi and limousine commission. There was a MTA bus system. There was beginning to be the regulatory framework for TNCs. There was a city Department of Transportation run by a very creative person, right? But all of those were separate. And today we're increasingly seeing cities say, okay, maybe we should think about creating mobility management offices. Obviously, delivery was an issue pre-COVID, and now with COVID, the delivery vehicles at the curb in their many forms, from Amazon Prime to Grubhub, et cetera. And then cross-cutting all this in a COVID period of time is dramatic drops in city revenue. So all of these are major changes in what's going on. Next slide, please. And then as we look at these issues, as we look at these issues, then let's step back and say, if I'm a public official, what is it that I'm trying to accomplish as I manage curbs and sidewalks, right? In addition to just the everyday movement of people, well, we have environmental issues that are very high in virtually every city. We have public health issues, which is if we touch as we touch coin exchangers or as we touch parking meters. Those are chances now for contamination and spread of disease. We have the issues of revenue, including fair pricing. What's a customer-centric design look like when this oriented around the customer and not the vendor or the third party? And we have the issues of equity. So let's keep in mind the values that we're trying to protect as city officials as we deal with other folks who have interest in curbs and sidewalks. Next slide. And so let's take each one of these separately very quickly. What's contactless government look like? So this just to kind of visualize, as we're thinking about COVID and other issues, let's consider how in a digital world, right? We see all over the country, cities making remarkable progress as they go from kind of inline to online to analog to digital. And that should exist to the way people engage with their city and city services, including parking meters or other elements at the curb as well. Next slide. And so as we go on, please, the next question would become, well, as we think about these issues, how does it relate to revenue? And this is just an interesting example from the city of Austin, where the mobility services supervisor, Joseph, is a very creative fellow. And he's saying, let's use the data that's available to figure out how to reduce the number of meters and pay stations. So he's using the data to look at the level of utilization of online apps. And as the utilization goes up, he's removed all the single meter spaces to begin with. But then as the utilization goes up, even the multi-meter spaces are thin. So this is to say the following. As we use data and we move to a digital system to manage the curb and the sidewalk, a couple of things happen. One, contamination goes down. Two, revenues go up because app payments at the curb yield a much higher rate than either credit cards or coins. We also know that app usage has a lower cost in terms of credit card fees. It has fewer expenses because you don't have to maintain the meters and the like. And if you are maintaining meters, you have fewer expenses in the way one organizes their enforcement. So without going into the slide in great detail, because the slides will be available, the point here is that data in terms of how to manage the curb plus a digital outlook will produce substantially additional revenues without rate increases at a time when cities are quite revenue starved. Next slide. As we go through the pricing issues, though, it's important, I think, to look at the other important component of a platform, which is data. So if we have comprehensive city data, then we can look at how to nudge behaviors through pricing, increasing pricing at events, lowering pricing where we have more supply than demand, allocating special rates for folks from certain communities who need assistance as they park, whether they're nurses going to the hospital or folks in lower income neighborhoods that are driving to commercial organizations. How do we think about pricing? How do we think about pricing in terms of enforcement? How do we think about pricing in terms of behaviors? So the new curb mobility regulation is one that says, let's be much more nuanced in the way we adjust for pricing. Next slide. Now, as we look at all of this coming together, it comes together in an open system platform. And what's that platform look like? Well, a city needs a platform to ingest all of the data, right? So let's say that eventually there'll be charges for where TNCs drop off, and some cities have this now, that there'll be charges for where your scooters are dropped or your scooters are picked up. There'll be charges for parking. There's, in many cities, charge an allocated fee for valet parking where you take out meters. So what is the value of all that? One cannot determine the value unless there's a platform that allows coordination on behalf of the city of the multiple parties who look at the use of the curb as an asset. That platform needs to assemble information, integrate the technologies, and allow the cities to do pricing, maintenance, and enforcement on their terms. Next slide, please. So what would that platform look like? Well, one, I mean, you could draw this out with as many options as one could consider, but it would be parking management, it would be micro mobility management, it would be license plate enforcement, it might be digital permits for special parking areas. You know, all of those sources of information, a city would say, need to integrate with our operating system, which needs to integrate with our payment system. And now we'll be able to allocate and price and use the pricing to adjust the behaviors that occur at the curb. Next slide. But is it enough just to think about digital? And we have these remarkable breakthroughs, right? So we went to credit card meters. That was a pretty cool thing at the time. And then we went to apps. That was a pretty cool thing at the time. And no matter what app one uses, then you start to ask a question which says, if the customer is at the center, shouldn't the customer have the ability to pay using any approved app that the city would allow? Well, it could be any one of the competing app providers. It could be Google Maps, Google Apps, Apple Pay, Apple Maps. In other words, let's create a system where the renter of the scooter or the user of a parking spot, that person, that customer of the city, that citizen of the city should be able to park using whatever is best for them. That in turn pushes up revenues and pushes up convenience and pushes down convenience because adoption goes up. Next slide, please. So as we ingest all this data, then as a regulator, the next big question for the city is, all right, what responsibilities do we have as a data regulator and a data facilitator? Well, one might be to say we're going to use this data for access purposes, right? We're going to determine equity, and we'll come back to that in a second. Another will be say that if we create a platform with protocols, then and we're able to integrate the data, then that should be a multi-party system, and it should be open. The next is, let's use the data to manage the curbs and sidewalks and streets as well. And then how do we use all of that data to produce enhanced service? Next slide. These data principles, and there's obviously a lot written about this, but I would just suggest a couple things. We got off to kind of, this always occurs, right, where the private sector and its technology maybe is a little more advanced than the city's ability to regulate it. But cities are catching up now. There's a lot of third-party services helping cities consider what their rules should be. And I would just suggest that, you know, as a city integrates its services with multiple vendors, it needs to keep control of important public values. One of those should be, there needs to be a single source of truth. And by that, I mean, the city retains the pricing, obviously, of how much it costs to park at a spot or drop a scooter at a spot. And that information needs to be available to all of the users. So it needs to be generated from a single source of truth. That single source of truth then is going to have access to a lot of data, and it needs to have rules in place for how it's protecting the privacy of that data for its residents who are consumers of city spaces. In other words, what protections should the city insist on for the data that comes from the end users? And that should include compliance with major data and payment platform standards, whether they're EU standards or the state of California standards or otherwise, rules on selling and commercializing the data as well. Then as we go forward, then how do we use public engagement? How do we consider the role of residents in engaging? And in this regard, the data visualization tools are important on behalf of the city as well. because those data visualization tools will allow engagement, the cities will be able to tell their communities levels of endorsement, levels of engagement, levels of take up in terms of app usage, and other important questions. And interoperability, obviously the APIs that come with a platform are important as well. Let's go forward. By the way, Brianne, I think my webcam is working if you change your mind. So this is just a suggestion for many of you who are on the call today, are members of NACTO. NACTO has on its site a great table of how one could think about the types of data, what types of data that are integrated with what other data, and the submission types of that data as well. Next slide. And next slide. So let's just close with a couple examples here. So as we think about asset managed through coding the curb, obviously cities need a real-time digital inventory of signage and parking rules. They need to be able to visualize and understand what that looks like. They need to simplify it so that their residents and customers can understand. And they need to consider dynamic pricing, and a moment or two in a second about dynamic pricing. Next slide. So as we look at these issues, these are a couple slides I picked up over time. How one might think about asset management. This is the city of San Francisco using data to shift the locations of driver pickups and drop-offs. This is pre-COVID, but kind of where would Lyft drop off, and then looking at the data at the curb in order to kind of move those drop-offs to places that were a little less busy and a little less congested for purposes of avoiding double parking in the backup. Next slide. Another way we might think about asset management is neighborhood parking permits. If everything goes to a digital world, they could be digital as well. And that would allow us to do more effective issuance of neighborhood permits, more effective enforcement because you could use license plate recognition or scanners, and easier visitor passes as well. Next slide. Next slide. How else could we think about this? Well, without reading through the whole slide, just go to the last bullet. Many of our systems are unintentionally discriminatory on equity issues, right? So if one is disabled and they have a disability app that helps them, like iAccess Life, for example, is just one, then the folks who depend on those apps should be able to locate services, including parking services or stopping services, through those apps as well. And so one way to think about equity is making it easier for disabled parking. Next slide. Another way to say address equity is to look at the scooter issue. And we should price the regulation of scooters so that we induce the scooters to be dropped off in places that don't block sidewalks or don't create hazards for folks on those sidewalks. And one way to do that is through pricing. Charlotte and other cities have run pilots looking at how to use platform management tools to do allocated pricing for purposes of collecting fees and for purposes of managing where the drop-offs are. Next slide. Many of you on the call today in many cities around the country are trying to work through the complexities of how to price the loading zones, the commercial loading zones. A same platform which would ingest data could also be used to charge those who drop off. This is very difficult in terms of implementation because of the variety of drop off. You know, some people are on bikes, some people are on scooters, some people are on Amazon Prime vans, et cetera. But the ability to price the commercial loading zone is quite important, not just as a revenue source, but for purposes of managing the clutter and safety around the curb and sidewalk. Next slide. And then a couple more comments about equity, and then we'll go to questions. As we consider equity, let's ask a question or two. So one reason that most cities in some states require payment options is so that the unbanked have an option when they pay for parking. But I wonder whether this is really an equitable solution. Wouldn't an equitable solution be to say, let's set up an app provision service so that unbanked folks could use an app, and if they don't have a smartphone, they could use it with a IVR voice service, so that how do we extend digital services to the unbanked? There are solutions. Obviously, many of our regional transit agencies have these solutions today. They can be linked over into parking solutions or other solutions as well. Secondly, and maybe even more provocatively, ask ourselves the following question. If we don't use dynamic pricing, and if we underprice the cost of parking in a commercially high value area, let's say that we artificially reduce the pricing at the curb so that the pricing in the off-street parking is 5x and the parking at the curb is 1x, then the city basically is saying, well, we're going to subsidize the parkers in those high rent districts, which makes very little sense, particularly when if we charge the right price, not an exorbitant price, but the right price, and we're able to secure an extra amount of revenue, that revenue could be used to subsidize access for transit in our communities where they have very bad transit access, the difficulties of getting to work on time. Maybe you take the new revenues from pricing the curb correctly and you allocate that for vouchers for Lyft and Uber Pool to get to a job center or the like. So just to suggest here that equity may mean evaluating pricing in a new way. And it also means the following. We have many non-English speakers in our cities these days, and we need to extend multilingual services to interacting with the curb and the sidewalk, whether one's on a scooter or paying for parking. And English-only apps tend to produce unfair results and a disproportionate amount of enforcement requests. Next slide. This is just one way to say how do we could take this is just a map. Many cities have this showing kind of transit deserts. This shows some transit deserts in Orlando and asks the question, if we had more revenue, how would we address those transit deserts? Next slide. And dockless vehicles are not the biggest issue in a COVID world, but they are an issue. And more importantly, they represent a use case. How can data help us? Cities, including Seattle and others, are saying if you want scooters in our community, then they need to be equitably deployed, not just deployed in the high rent districts. The platform helps manage where they're located, helps charge for their usage, helps even maybe charge more when they're dropped like this than when they're dropped in a certain place. All of this is how one would think about an emerging use case for dockless vehicles. Next slide. Borrow that from Josh. And then this is a site that we run at Harvard, a couple books on just general using digital tools to transform cities, and a paper in the center about reforming mobility management. Let me just kind of close with the following. If you think about any one of these changes, they're not that big. If you think about all the changes together, all the platform changes, all the technology changes, all the use changes, all the demands in our cities about revenue and equity, legitimate concerns about important issues, the ability to bring these together with a mobility manager, the ability to use pricing to kind of nudge behaviors at the curb, the ability to think more equitably about how we allocate revenues and expenses and opportunity in our communities. This is not only the most complex time, it's the most exciting time to be in this business at the city level or county level or regional level. I'm delighted that you allowed me to spend a little bit of time with you today. Thanks.
Hey, I'm happy to try a camera if you'd like.
Yeah, I think I'm looking at it okay. We'll see if I might scare away some of your
let's see. Still not able to see you yet.
Okay.
That's okay. If we're not able to get it on, I can hop off too. But in the meantime, just an announcement that we've had a few questions come in, but feel free to keep sending those in, folks, and we'll get on with the discussion here. There we go.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Yeah, seems like it's working. There was a little bit of a lag earlier, so we went camera free, but I think we're good to have a discussion now. So as I said, several questions have come in. I'll start with one here. Mayor Goldsmith, your presentation started by talking about the mix of priorities that cities and regulators in cities are dealing with. So it could be, sustainability imperatives or health imperatives. Do you have examples of cities that are using data to inform shifts to new priorities? And so I'm thinking, of the current COVID context. That's something that's unfolding in real time. How are cities as regulators making data-based decisions to react to something that's so new?
Well, it's actually an interesting question because let me think about it out loud for a second. In a pre-COVID world, I think you would use your digital tools to say to a restaurant, look, you want to take out 4 parking meters in front of your store at your restaurant because you want to expand cafe space. Those meters were producing X dollars a piece in those months. Pay us X dollars and the space is yours. In a post-COVID, well, we're not a long way from a post-COVID, but during a COVID response, you might say, well, we need to do whatever we can to support our restaurant retailers. So we want to absorb that cost. We're going to still take out those meters for purpose of expanding cafe. But as we come out of that, then we might say, well, we have this difference between drop-off spaces, cafe uses, valet drop-offs, where we still have valet spaces. How should we price each of those? So all I'm suggesting is that if we had the opportunity today to look at that data, space by space, block by block, and usage, and let's ask the question of what are we actually subsidizing? And if we're subsidizing it, maybe we want to subsidize it, but inadvertently subsidizing it doesn't make any sense. So those are all different issues. And you can also think about it in the following. We may say, for my scooter, there is a fee in our city per scooter. But if you drop the scooter off because we can now monitor it, in these spaces, the fee will be greater. In other words, that you get the scooter companies to help manage the behaviors of the riders. So those are just different ways to think about the questions.
Great, thank you. So you briefly touched on the notion of interoperability. I'm wondering if there should be a standard approach to regulating data or new devices across places or across different apps. How do you I guess reckon with this notion of interoperability?
So this is a really important question, because you can't have interoperability and a whole array of different data standards. And I would suggest the following, that the city, I keep calling it a city, sometimes it could be a county, sometimes it could be a metro transit agency, but that it identifies the important criteria that support whether or not you can bring your commercial application into our city, right? So it's kind of, think about the tug of war we had with the TNCs and Uber. That's a little bit better now because cities said, here are the standards for data sharing, et cetera. That was an imperfect way to manage that. Negotiation goes more of a battle. Now I'm suggesting that cities say, oh, here are our rules on data, privacy, commercializing data, anonymizing data. Here are our rules on payment platform, making sure that it's certified, meets the highest standards. Here are our rules on equity. That is to say, you can't just pick the most profitable areas in our city. We're going to monitor that. So that all of those make up basic building blocks of a set of protocols that are the prerequisites to coming into the city. And then you say, and then after you say that, you say, anybody can meet these, come on in. We want to have as many choices for, some choices for our folks who are disabled, some apps that work for folks that are unbanked, some services that work for people who don't have smartphones, some that fill in the blank, right? And so that the protocols are common, that the platform is open in the sense that it can communicate with the apps, and then we encourage people to come to the city.
Very good. With respect to the actual technology that's used, so I think there's kind of a maybe an underlying assumption that this is cell phone or smartphone based technology. Somebody mentioned though, or with respect to congestion pricing, so Tollinggantries, which are physical devices, physical kind of beams that go over the highway. Is there a benefit to being open to a number of different options in terms of the actual physical assets that are being used?
Right, so this is a challenge for the average city because for a couple of reasons. One, that our procurement cycles are so long that we run the risk of buying technology at about the same time it becomes obsolete, right? So if you think about enforcement, right, there could be, first of all, let's think about a model enforcement system. Well, it has a man or a woman who's a public employee or a third-party contractor who has a handheld tool. That handheld tool should say, here are the places that are most likely to have a car park that's in violation. Here's how you should set up your routes, etc. Well, as that evolves, that may be a mixture between a person writing tickets, a license plate reader that is either fixed on a pole or go up and down the streets. That may be connected to a camera that's doing AI on virtual imaging for enforcement purposes, etc. And so those technologies need to be allowed by a city. It's not like a city needs all of them, but it needs to have enough flexibility it can add to them. And what we've got here in most cities, and I say this as a, as a culprit, not just as an accuser, right? That the way we're procuring solutions is not in the best interests of our residents because the cycles are way too long and they don't invite creativity. So what one would want to do is invite a vendor in and say to that vendor that we, the city, retain the right to ask you to modernize that technology as it gets better, and we have reserved the right to ask others into your community as well. And many cities are facing that now. They may have, there's 3 or 4 major parking app providers, pay by phone type apps in the country today. But many cities are now saying, why do I have just one? I want all of them, right? And so how do you create a platform that does that as well?
Very good. So I'll have 1 or 2 questions on equity now. So when we're discussing equity, are there any tips that you have or anything that you've seen from your experience about how we can ensure that people from the community are really involved front and center in those conversations instead of private companies maybe coming in and steering that conversation?
All right. So there's of course at multiple levels of the equity conversation. One, I would suggest, not exactly the intent of your question, but I was a politician anyway, I'll just answer it. I'll answer the question I want to answer, though maybe it's not quite the one you asked. That is the following: money is fungible. And so revenues from place A can be used to subsidize a solution in place B. And that's why I suggested that it's inequitable not to charge an appropriate rate in an area where the rate could be much higher, because that means you're explicitly saying, I don't need the revenue to subsidize better transit in place B. So let's remember that we can drive money from one area and use it to subsidize inadequate service in another. That's one. 2, that if we have data visualization tools that are clear and we have data from the curb that's clear, right? We know what's going on. We can superimpose pedestrian information, anonymized pedestrian information with the platform information. Then we visualize that, and the pricing of parking there, which is very important to the local retailer, can be an engaged conversation with those retailers. Years ago, I was working in a major U.S. city, I guess probably shouldn't mention it, but that had much of their parking was kind of controlled by local bids, right? And so those business improvement districts had a stake in the parking rates in those areas. And if you said to them, let's rethink parking in a way that benefits your retailers, what should the price be that encourages turnover? Let's look at what turnover is. Let's look at how long cars are parking there now with the pricing you have and the costs of that. Then that community conversation can inform the conversation as well. And then finally, I think that one of the most important issues today is there are a number of underserved communities, and there are folks who live in those communities have often really long commutes for moderately to low paid jobs. It's a huge tax on their income. And so how do we overcome that if there's inadequate bus service? And there's obviously issues with bus service and COVID, but assuming that that's not an issue, how do we overcome that? And that the subsidy of that transportation is important. That's similarly the reason why it's appropriate for cities to say, yeah, bring your scooters into my city, and but we're going to watch a percentage of scooters that need to be deployed in areas that need help, right, that have limited resources. So all of those are ways to think about equity. So equity means involving the community. Equity means paying attention to the community, and equity also means linking the resources that you can derive from one community to help solve the problems in the under-resourced communities.
Great. So aside from revenue, what are 2 or 3 additional variables that should be evaluated when determining curb space priorities?
Well, there's a great conversation going on now, in large part driven by NACTO and Jeanette Sadiq-Khan on kind of the use of streets and curbs. So as we come out of COVID or we emerge during this period of time, the data can help inform us on cafe space, sidewalk space, drop-off space. What do we want our streets and curbs to look like? So the whole physical nature, the ability. One of the issues here with congestion at the curb is we want to have walkable spaces. So how do we use the pricing of these drop-offs in order to create more walkable spaces? The next issue is, cities are suffering losses of revenue in part because local retailing is down. It's a huge effect. People are losing their jobs, whereas cities are also losing their revenues. So as we switch from more and more brick and mortar to more and more delivery, then it's legitimate for a city to say, both for purposes of regulating congestion and safety and for revenue, that commercial drop-off spaces should be properly priced and available for reservation. So all of those are issues during this period of major change, as well as saying, look, we have a responsibility as city officials to make our services as convenient as possible to our residents and users. So if you drive from the suburbs to the center city, should you really have to download a specific app in order to park somewhere, right? So let's create a UX around the user's experience that makes it easy for him or her to transact their business in a city.
That's great. One more curb space question. So somebody asked if you have any advice for agencies to address similarities or differences in curb space policy between adjacent jurisdictions?
Well, yeah, there's a question about it between adjacent jurisdictions. There's also a question between city agencies, right? You got a bus department, a taxi department, a transportation department. They all have their own issues with respect to curb and sidewalk space, let alone the utilities that may be tearing them up at the same time, right? And so I think it's a disservice to each of those agencies, and particularly the parking folks, to not have a platform that has data from multiple agencies, so that they can communicate with each other and they can make policies together. And there's a lot of really good professionals in each of those departments who usually don't have the data they need to manage in the way they want to. Secondly, the regional planning organizations are stronger some places than they are other places. Southern California's regional planning, regional community, regional cities, the Southern California regional. By the time I finish the sentence, I'm going to remember the name, but it's one of the biggest and most significant, and it does planning over the whole region, 160 different cities, multiple different counties, and it's looking in. So what it's doing with its mapping, right, is each of the components are mapping what they're doing, and then the region is helping put together the modules of that mapping so that you have a viewpoint from region to region, neighborhood to neighborhood, city to city. So that has two important issues. One is planning across city boundaries. And the next issue with respect to the planning is the ability for a resident of city A to consume services in city B. And that goes back to the parking app situation. The Southern California Regional Association of Cities and Counties is doing a terrific job with that.
Very good. And this might be the last question, depending on how much detail we go into, but I like this one. So one person asked, for you, what are the low-hanging fruits here? So of all the ideas that you've discussed today, what are the one or two things that everybody, every city, county can and should be doing right now?
Well, let's think about it this way. A, go to a multi-app solution for parking. Go to a solution that is in more languages than just English. Go to a solution that creates a platform for data management for the city. That's not as difficult as it sounds. 4, think about pricing more aggressively so that there are the revenues and resources available to help solve major problems. But I'm going to write down here because I've stumbled so many times over the name of, there you go. If I can't say it, I can type it. The Southern California Association of Governments. But I would recognize the following. The complexity here is not technology. The complexity is narrative. Back years ago when I was trying to build out the downtown of Indianapolis, I thought my only job was, I thought I was the mayor of parking. I didn't think really anything mattered except parking in downtown Indianapolis, right? I couldn't, people wouldn't move in an office building unless they had access to parking. They wouldn't open up a restaurant unless they had valet. They wouldn't fill, right? Everything was about parking. And yet, if you went to talk about the right price of parking, then the number of people who told you you can't sell parking on Saturdays or Sundays, you can't do it after 6 o'clock, you can't do it at the right price. There was always an organized constituency against X. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. The number of meters, the amount of pricing, digital permits for neighborhoods, access for the disabled and multilingual. But in the end, what we're not doing, and this is the job of the mayor, not the job of the parking commissioner or the transit commissioner, is to paint a narrative that says our city needs more equity in the way it manages transit and transportation, and the components of equity are A, B, and C. So the narrative plus the low-hanging fruit will yield results quickly.
Excellent. Well, that is unfortunately all the time that we have for today. Thank you, Mayor Goldsmith, and thanks also to our listeners. ENO's next webinar, Toward Universal Access, which examines the FTA Mobility on Demand Sandbox project in Los Angeles in the Puget Sound region, will be this Thursday at 4 p.m. As always, don't forget to sign up for ENO Transportation Weekly for regular updates on our work and other transportation policy matters. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.